Human beings are not actually masters of the nature they live in. Humans are children of this nature. They exist within it, together with it, and can only exist in this way. If humans try to destroy this nature or attempt to dominate it, since they will not succeed, they can actually be accused of sawing off the branch they are sitting on. Tomatoes, the varieties of tomatoes we eat today were actually not like this in the past. Or apples, the apples grown in Turkey today. They were not like this once upon a time. Or the wild apples in nature are actually much smaller and perhaps not very pleasant for us to eat. It might be a tree with tiny fruits, perhaps with bitter fruits. In other words, we believe that if all the country's protected areas are connected to each other by corridors, we can better preserve plant and animal diversity. At least the ministry has thought this way and implemented such policies, but what are we as citizens going to do? During my master's and doctoral studies in biology, I actually delved into taxonomy, that is the subject of classification. In fact, I studied lichens, which are a group of living organisms under botany. To explain, in ancient or classical times, we mostly divided living things into two groups. Since Aristotle, these have been plants and animals. Accordingly, biology's two main branches used to be botany and zoology, focusing on these two main groups. It manifests itself in the form of zoology. However, starting from the 18th century, or according to some, even from the 16th or 17th centuries, the subfields of biology began to differentiate more and more. As a result, we see that biology has many subfields and subdisciplines. One of them is 18, that is the science of classification. The primary goal is first to determine the quantity of this diversity of living organisms on Earth, to learn, measure, and understand its quantity and quality. For this purpose, of course, natural observations are made. As you know, humans have another characteristic. Humans are living beings who give names to objects. This is a trait we do not see in other living creatures. Therefore, every living thing is actually given names in different languages. These names, for instance, just as organism A and organism B can be confused in different languages. Sometimes the same organism is given different names, and sometimes the same names are given to different organisms. A number of initiatives have been started to solve all these problems. 20th century, with digital technology now serving biology, every article containing this kind of taxonomic data is published. They are scanned once a month, and there is a website on the internet. It's called the Catalogue of Life, or the Catalogue of Living Things. The numbers there are updated regularly. Now, when we look at these updated figures, it appears as though the number of species is constantly increasing due to data processing. In reality, the number of species is not increasing that much. Why is that? Because, for example, as we continue to explore new places like the Amazon rainforest or newly reached regions of Africa, new plant, animal, or other living species are being discovered. These are added to the list, but on the other hand, there are also species that we are losing. Now, in this regard, for example, as the homeland of Turkey, what is our situation in terms of biodiversity within the borders of the Republic of Turkey? So in this respect, do we possess a certain value, a kind of richness? When we ask these questions, the topic of biodiversity also becomes a subject of biophilosophy. In a way, we are engaging in a kind of axiology here. In other words, what does it mean if we have a high number of species, if the number of plant or animal species in our country is high? These numbers, when we compare these numbers with those of other countries or continents, what kind of picture will we see?
What competition will we enter? Can we call this cultural richness? How should we view biological diversity?
Now, first of all, this is not a value that we as humans have created. Most likely it already existed when the Turks arrived in Anatolia. In fact, it was there even before the Turks, when Byzantium was established. It probably existed during the Hittite period as well. Of course, throughout history, the emergence of some living beings and the extinction of others, these things can happen naturally. But what we mean when we talk about preserving biodiversity here is this. A similar, unfortunately painful example of this has been seen in the Amazon rainforest. Because the forests have been turned into agricultural land or urbanized, will be cleared. When the land is converted, there is a severe, drastic decline in the number of species living there. Since it's impossible to predict in advance what kind of consequences this might lead to, and because it can sometimes trigger effects like the domino effect or the butterfly effect, it is assumed that it could even alter climate events on a global scale, actually. Now, putting climate events aside for a moment, for example, if we talk about Turkey, especially since it is our homeland, there are about 2 million species on Earth. I'll be giving you approximate numbers. I'm telling you, there are around 2 million living species. Of these, about 750, zero belong to the group of invertebrates, especially insects. But the share of plants in these biodiversity figures corresponds to around 30%. In fact, there is more insect diversity than plant diversity. This is evident across the entire planet. In the biosphere, it's like this. When it comes to our country, since botany has been studied more, botanical taxonomy is more developed, we are able to provide these figures a bit more accurately for our country. The studies that were conducted by the British botanist Davis in the 1950s and 60s are now being carried out by Turkish researchers. In other words, the flora of Turkey has been completed. A new illustrated version is now being published under the auspices of the presidency. According to the latest figures, there are more than 10 zero plant species in Turkey. What are these plant species? Which plant species are we talking about? Let's clarify this first. These are the plant species that grow naturally in the wild, not cultivated or planted by humans plants that God has bestowed upon us.
They call them Hüde Unabit.
Yes, these are what we refer to as Hüde Unabit plant species, because when humans get involved for various purposes, let's say using agricultural techniques, we can actually alter these plant species over time. So viewers will see when they research that the tomatoes we eat today are quite different. In fact, they weren't like this once upon a time. Or apples, the apples grown in Turkey today weren't always like this either. Or in nature, wild apples are actually much smaller and maybe not very pleasant for us to eat. They might be trees with tiny fruits, with bitter fruits, but through farming, agriculture, and cultivation, we have produced all sorts of varieties and types from these apples. However, botany doesn't deal with these cultivated varieties. These are studied by agricultural engineers or similar scientific fields. We specifically classify wild, naturally growing plants. We mentioned that there are over 10 zero plant species. Now, another concept comes up here. Endemic plant. What do we mean by endemic plant? If there are plants that grow only on the lands of Turkey, since we are using Turkey as an example, and we call these endemic species.
Unique to us, belonging to our region.
Plants that belong to our country. Every country catalogs its endemic plants in this way. And even long-term observations. If through such observations you find that these species are at risk of decline or extinction, you put them on the red list so that you can develop conservation programs. You impose certain restrictions on activities in the areas where these plants live and grow. The important thing is to ensure the survival of those plant species, because we as humans might think that we can live anywhere. In Turkey, the number of endemic plant species is over 3,500, naturally. This means a rate of over 30%. A rate of over 30% can be explained in the simplest terms like this. Whenever you go out into any natural area to land that hasn't been heavily used by humans, in Turkey, 1 out of every 3 plants you encounter grows only within the borders of the Republic of Turkey. Therefore, when picking, pulling, uprooting, or digging up a plant in the field, in other words, when you remove that plant from its place, we may need to be very careful, because we might be destroying a plant that exists only there. Now, one might think like this: I went to have a picnic at work. Would something like this really happen if I just picked a few daisies there? We're not talking about something that simple. But when you try to build a villa in the middle of a forest, and even a villa is a small example, when you want to open a larger construction site, if this is an area where endemic plants grow, if it is a local area, we do not destroy those plants. This is also a loss for Turkey. Viewers might think, so what? I mean, what difference does it make if 3 plants are missing from some mountain of God? The thing is, we don't know which of those 3 plants might be the cure for cancer. At this moment, or we don't know which one will be extremely valuable in the future. We don't know what kind of molecule or what kind of nutrient can be obtained from which one, because these studies have not yet been completed, because science is constantly evolving. So even in the worst case scenario, even if we think in a utilitarian or pragmatic way, even if it's just with the thought that it might be useful to us in the future, such endemic plants or regions in our country that are extremely rich in plant diversity need to be protected. The Ministry of Environment and Forestry's names of the ministries have changed constantly. Throughout our history, we have had protected areas like the Ministry of Forestry, the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, our nature parks, national parks, conservation areas, environmental protection, and so on. In this regard, when we compare with the past, There was also a project to connect these conservation areas to each other. They explained this in Ankara. It turned out really well. In other words, we believe that if all the protected areas in the country are connected to each other by corridors, we will be able to better preserve plant and animal diversity. At least the ministry thought this way and implemented such policies. But what are we going to do as citizens? What are our responsibilities? These questions can be asked here. For example, when we think about the plant-based products we eat, drink, or use in other ways in our daily lives, we actually don't come into contact with that many plant species in our everyday lives. However, it should be noted that there is a tremendous difference between the diversity of animal products we encounter and the diversity of plant products. In fact, we interact with plants much more. However, these plants we are dealing with are actually like the camel's ear in nature. In fact, across the country's land, there are far more types of plants than what we call plant diversity. The important thing is to protect that area, after all. And we need to protect it in the following way. On one hand, we need to feed our people. We have to keep increasing agricultural production. On the other hand, there's a need for industrialization, or say an airport. You're going to build an airport. You're going to develop various housing projects. You're going to build roads. While making life easier for people, you also need to protect nature. One aspect of nature conservation is actually about nature itself. Right now, we're not protecting it just for ourselves. We need to think about it this way as well. It is essential to protect these lands for our children and their children, for our future generation 7, if only reluctantly for now, or with the thought that it might be beneficial in the future. So with urbanization, biodiversity. Is there a connection, as you mentioned? There is. In city centers, in the urban areas we call polis or Kent, the number of plant species is gradually decreasing. Just like with animal species.
Yes, Professor, I actually want to touch on that a bit. Now we've been talking entirely about plants, because in fact we see that animals are valued more in modern times. I mean, value, or what kind of concept should we use? Maybe we care more about animals? We touched on this a bit in the previous episode as well, about this 10 or 15 years ago, animals weren't valued or perhaps even considered this much. Today, with the increase in pet ownership, a very different kind of attitude has emerged toward them. But such an awareness hasn't developed yet when it comes to plants. There's a distinction here. And also, as you mentioned, from another perspective, when we look at it in terms of urbanization and biodiversity, any construction, be it a hotel, a building, or a large residential area done in the name of urban development, will significantly impact biodiversity and cause disruptions. It can lead to irreversible consequences. These are major problems, especially when we look at it in terms of the value given to plants. How should the concept of value be addressed? How do you see this? Should we look at it in terms of benefit? Would that be too pragmatic? How is the value of a plant measured? Is it the benefit it provides us, or should we base it on its potential to provide benefits? Who decides whether a plant is valuable or not?
Who decides whether a plant is valuable or not? If you ask a botanist this question, they will most likely say that it should be taxonomists, botanists, who decide whether a plant is valuable or not. So it's not that a plant becomes valuable just because we attribute value to it. In other words, the subject here is human beings. The subject, the one who studies and examines nature, who investigates how those living things originate, reproduce, change, and evolve, is human. But it's also a fact that recent literature constantly refers to the Anthropocene, an age centered on humans, and its negative aspects are constantly brought up. Last week, I also talked with Professor Mahmoud, who has written books on environmental ethics and conservation. It was a similar topic. For example, this is something that is emphasized or put forward. Yes, let's protect the environment, let's protect plants, animals, in other words, all living beings that we mean by biodiversity. But here, there are some approaches that ignore humans. We can't achieve this with arguments, policies, or rhetoric that ignore humans. Because the agent who is supposed to protect is already the human. In other words, humans should be educated in such a way that, unless absolutely necessary, they do not end the life of a plant or animal.
So we ask, who are we protecting them from? We are protecting them, but from whom?
From ourselves. For whom are we protecting them? Actually, for ourselves. That is, for the continuation of the human species, we may need to protect certain living beings from humans. When it comes to the issue of value in axiology, one of the most naive and mildest expressions is the idea that we should protect them because in the future they might somehow contribute to our health or food. That's one of the most naive, mildest ways to put it. There is also such an approach. This is also acceptable, but it's a somewhat stronger approach. In environmental ethics or bioethics, what actually needs to be brought up more loudly, which is directly connected to the philosophy of biology and conservation biology, is that every living organism actually has its own selfhood. Today, we can state this a bit more emphatically or more loudly. And as far as we can see, these living organisms actually form species populations and species. The important question here is it the protection of individuals, the protection of species, or the protection of a limited piece of land that matters? In fact, what truly matters here is the protection of ecosystems. In other words, a land area with defined boundaries. We must protect a piece of land, air, or sea, along with all the living and non-living factors within it, so that we can protect the species. So a biologist should avoid such approaches. Let's just protect the plants here. Or soil is inanimate, we don't need to protect it. Or water is inanimate, we don't need to protect it. Or rocks are inanimate, we don't need to protect them. You can say that. Because the very existence of those plants or the organisms there depends on the soil, stone, rock, water, and air there, as well as the local climate conditions.
You also need to protect the habitat.
The way to preserve those conditions is to maintain the ecosystem in that environment just as it is, to preserve it without too much interference. So how can this be done? If a project is going to be built here and it happens to be right on top of something important, the location of the project can be shifted a bit. If you don't build anything on the protected areas, you can still construct your project nearby. In fact, you can also put that area under protection. There's actually a good example of this in Turkey's history. When the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline was being laid, along the route where this pipeline would pass, botanists objected, claiming that there were important plant areas along the route. The Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan consortium of the period says, then come on, sir, show us exactly where these protected plant areas are. We can change the route of the oil pipeline. In other words, it doesn't have to pass through there. It can pass just 2 kilometers away. This is the pipeline. It's actually a very pragmatic approach. By the end of the project, the pipeline route had been changed several times. And all the areas along the old route that needed protection were fully preserved. In fact, the BTC consortium even published a nice book about this. Here is the BTC pipeline, but inside it also contains information with photos about Turkey's plant diversity. So when there is such a good example like this in the history of the Republic of Turkey, why shouldn't we do this in the future? Why not? Of course we can do it. Do we need to build a dam somewhere? What I mean here are large-scale constructions. Of course, even your individual house construction can harm the environment. But on a much smaller scale, like a dam, for example, or like an airport or a highway project or large projects such as opening up an entire area for urbanization. If there is a plant area, and especially if it is a very important plant area, you should move the construction site, if possible, to another location. In this way, from a botanical perspective, you will have contributed to the preservation of those living beings there.
The more God expands, the more the risk actually increases.
To put it very simply, 1 out of every 3 plants we randomly encounter in our natural habitats may only grow in Turkey and nowhere else in the world. If we destroy it, we'll be depriving the world of such a value forever. Do we have the right to do this?
Of course not. So, Professor, you mentioned protection here. It actually seems like a responsibility, like something entrusted to us. How should we conceptualize this? Previously here we held a talk titled Nature Entrusted to Us. Back then we mostly approached it from a religious perspective in the context of theology and the psychology of religion. We discussed how nature is a trust from God to us and that we all have a responsibility to protect it. We did a program on this topic with Professor Ali Aitan. This conversation reminded me a bit of that as well. As a biologist, as a botanist, how do you view our responsibility or dominion over nature, and how should we evaluate this?
You've already done the program. I think you've done it, and it turned out really well. That phrase has become a kind of slogan. Should I say that this environment, nature, or living beings are entrusted to us? Now, first of all, we are part of this system. We're not actually outside of it. Because we are inside it, any intervention we make in this system from within, whether positive or negative, will have certain consequences for us or for future generations. The fact that we don't see these effects today definitely does not mean that they are harmless. I mean, in some aspects of nature, because there are still many parameters whose mysteries, secrets, or how they work, we have not yet fully 100% figured out, there is a huge amount of data. With this much data, how we are supposed to deal with it is a separate topic of discussion. The idea of dominance, of being dominant, is something I would like to object to here, for example. Humans are actually not dominant over the nature they live in. Humans are a child of this nature. They can only exist within and together with this nature. If they, try to destroy this nature or try to establish dominance over it, they won't be able to succeed at that either. In fact, the human species could be accused of sawing off the branch it is sitting on. Whose branch are we talking about? In fact, you end up cutting off the branches that future generations will sit on. Let me put it this way. Why are we talking so much about plants? Saying botany is actually a very broad field. A branch of science. It studies the kingdom of fungi, the plant kingdom, and also some unicellular organisms. The photosynthetic ones, the consumption of organisms that, like us, perform aerobic respiration on Earth. We know that the main source of oxygen is actually photosynthetic organisms living mostly in the oceans and seas, and after that, trees or their derivatives living in forests. So every tree we cut down, every algae or seaweed we destroy in the ocean could lead to a decrease in our oxygen levels. One day you won't be able to breathe. What will we do? The problems can be this serious. That's why we need to pay attention to these things starting now. In my personal opinion, we are a part of this nature. We are definitely not the masters of nature, but we do have certain responsibilities. Now, to whom do we bear this responsibility? Religious people might think that they are responsible to a creator God. This can actually be quite effective, as it can be seen as a real sense of responsibility. Because by developing a kind of ethics, they say, even in an environment where no one is watching, I am not alone. I might choose not to cut down a tree if I don't need to, and if it doesn't harm me either. Why should I uproot a plant? Why should I cut down a tree? One might think, or one could do this by developing a kind of morality through philosophical means, by creating certain ethical rules that are personal or specific to society. But as we discussed in the first part, while we talk about protecting plants, living beings, and organisms, right now, in many places around the world, people are actually being destroyed. People are being killed. That's also the reality. In other words, the world is also a place like this. We believe that we are always responsible for setting good examples, giving positive messages, and inviting people to do good. Just because people are being killed somewhere else, we are not going to stay here and burn our forests. We will protect our forests, we will protect our seas, we will beautify and preserve our cities. This came to my mind because the topic is related to religion. I mentioned this in the program once. All of us have an image or a utopian vision of paradise in our minds or imaginations. It will be lush green with rivers and some corners of nature that we see as incredibly beautiful. We even call these places a corner of paradise. There is always this idea of paradise in our mind. There is a paradise we assume we will go to one day. How we will get there is another matter, a topic for debate. But it's as if we always imagine paradise not here, but somewhere else. I mean, human beings, especially the people living in Turkey, that's who I'm referring to here. Why shouldn't they turn the places they live into paradise? Why paradise? Why don't we make it happen here? Wouldn't it be better if there were little corners of paradise in our cities and natural landscapes, both for ourselves and for our children?
We make people experience hell right here, Professor.
I mean, this could be thought of as cities we enjoy living in, streets, gardens, offices, campuses where we actually enjoy life. But people are unhappy. People, I mean, especially those living in big cities, because there's the crowd, the traffic, air pollution, noise pollution, and so on. These are all factors, things that can make people unhappy every single day. How can we possibly have happy people in the midst of all this? So we need to look at ways to address this, at least a little. We can do things like planting or growing plants wherever we can reach.
As nice as we can.
Of course, because every single person's individual means their level of engagement. Since everyone's potential is different, I think our obligations and responsibilities are also different. Now, since I know a bit more about some topics here, naturally, my responsibility is greater. Therefore, maybe I need to plant more trees than you do. Did I plant them? You did, teacher.
Thank you for your effort. But it's all of our responsibility.
We, especially those of us with technical or academic knowledge, also need to consider this. Now, for example, what do we actually mean by planting a tree? Especially those with evergreen leaves, or those that shed their leaves constantly. We try to plant conifers, which we call needle-leaf trees. So they stay green in winter and give us oxygen. But it can also be considered this way. For example, since we live in Istanbul, let's use it as an example. If we bring in a species of pine that has never existed in Istanbul's flora throughout history and plant it in Istanbul, does that mean we are greening Istanbul or preserving the natural life here? So which trees should we plant here? We should plant the trees or plants of this region, of this vegetation, after researching them. But for example, I'm from Sparta. So in Sparta, we should plant trees and plants that are suitable for Sparta's vegetation. For this, we need to know a bit more about botany, or at least consult an expert.
Of course, yes, just planting any tree we want doesn't actually benefit the environment here. Even if it does, it's not enough, or maybe it's not the best approach. We need to take more appropriate steps.
So for those watching us who currently have trees or plants ready to be planted, plant them in the most suitable place as soon as possible. Plant as many plants as you can. There's no harm in doing it this way. But for those who know and do their research, we can say this. If you plant trees and plants that are suitable for the local flora, you increase both their chances of survival there and their chances of taking root. And you leave a healthier legacy for the future.
This way, you take more conscious and solid steps. Nature. Well then, Professor, let this be our recommendation as well. If we become more aware about botany, we can increase our responsibilities in this area and take more positive steps. Maybe. Thank you very much for your valuable comments and suggestions. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, today we discussed the relationship between biodiversity and urbanization. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.